Slide is showing us specific nuclei that are located in the brainstem. So this first part on the left is referring to the midbrain. On the right, we have the pons, and then we have the medulla below that. So we'll look at the midbrain first. One of the interesting things that it has is what's called the para-aqueductal gray matter. What's really interesting about that and kind of prevalent for this time is that it plays a role in pain suppression. So they found some evidence that there are opiate receptors in that area. They're called mu receptors. So it is potential maybe in the future that they could do deep brain stimulation and stimulate this area of the brain to prevent that and increase pain control for some patients. So the para-aqueductal gray matter links with the amygdala, part of our emotional brain, and our autonomic nervous system. So we don't really see those on this particular slide for the midbrain, but we do see some of the other things like the superior colliculus, which was, remember, visual tracking. We see the cerebral aqueduct, I don't know why I accidentally clicked on the wrong one. I did that before. The substantia nigra. And again, the substantia nigra, it's important for you to know that that plays a role with dopamine. And as we're going to learn later, it has to do with Parkinson's. When this says pyramidal tract, you don't need to know pyramidal tract. It's essentially referring to the corticospinal tract. So the substantia nigra controls subconscious muscle activity, and the cerebellar peduncles are located for the corticospinal tract. So this would be part of the cerebral peduncle. You certainly don't have to know the crus cerebri. You do need to know reticular formation, but some of these others, like tectum, are not important. The reticular formation, as we'll talk more about, sort of acts to filter out external stimuli. The pons is what connects higher brain centers and the spinal cord. It has what's called the pneumotaxic center that works with the medulla and is involved in respiratory rate. So what happens is the medulla sets the basic respiration, and then the pneumotaxic center, which is in the pons, is then going to alternate the rate and the depth to maintain normal rhythm of breathing. So we're going to take a look at the pons over here. And in the pons, we can see, again, the peduncle with the corticospinal tract, another peduncle with the corticospinal tract, the fourth ventricle, which, as you recall, has cerebrospinal fluid, the reticular formation, which is responsible for filtering out all kinds of extra stuff. Again, you don't have to know pyramidal tract and other pontine nuclei that I have not mentioned. So the last part of this slide is going to be the medulla, and the medulla contains a choroid plexus, and it has a cardiovascular control. This cardiovascular control adjusts to force and rate of heart contraction. It also has a vasomotor center, which adjusts blood vessel diameter for blood pressure. So it has reflex centers, which are super important. Those reflex centers would respond to things like low blood pressure, and it would send a signal to the medulla. The medulla would make a response to increase not only contractility of the heart, but also increase the contraction of the blood vessels via the motor center. There's ascending sensory information from muscle proprioceptors, as well as vestibular nuclei to cerebellum that go through it. So it has various other centers as well, which is very cool. And these various centers are going to be important for things like nausea. So if somebody is nauseous, it's going to have an opening for that for hiccup, swallowing, coughing, things like that. As you can see, it has the choroid plexus here that's between the medulla as well as the cerebellum. And then the rest of the nuclei you're not going to be responsible for, like pyramid, inferior olivary nuclei, nucleus ambiguus, others that I'm going to go ahead and cross off. And the reticular formation is all shown here, which we are going to be talking about next. The cerebellum's job is that it provides precise timing and appropriate patterns of skeletal muscle contraction. It's about 11% of the brain mass, so it's fairly significant. It plays a major role in balance, and the cortex of the cerebellum calculates the best way to perform a movement. So some of the parts of the cerebellum that we see here are the cerebellar cortex. That's what's going to calculate the best way to perform a movement. The arbor vitae means tree of life, arbor meaning tree, vitae meaning life. And we also see part of the brainstem, the pons and the medulla oblongata. Notice that the fourth ventricle is located between the pons and the cerebellum. Also located in that vicinity is another choroid plexus, where there is cerebrospinal fluid that is going to be produced. So looking at some of the other images here, we again see in the illustration the cerebellar cortex, the arbor vitae, the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle with ependymal cells, the medulla oblongata. You're not responsible for the cerebellar peduncles, so I'll cross them out along with the follicular nodular node, posterior lobe, and anterior lobe. So over here, you don't need to know the posterior lobe, the folia, the anterior lobe. And then when we look down here, we'll cross off some of these. But you do need to know the fact that this is basically a homunculus, like we saw earlier for the cerebral cortex. So the cerebellum is going to receive impulses from the cerebral cortex of their intent to initiate voluntary muscle contraction. Those signals from the proprioceptors throughout the body all go to the cerebellum. So those continuously inform the cerebellum of the body's position and momentum. So we have these voluntary signals, which are conscious, and they are going to come from the frontal lobe. Think of that homunculus, that somatosensory map that you saw a few slides ago. We also have an involuntary, which would be subconscious at the cerebellum. And that's because the cerebellum is constantly receiving information from proprioceptors. And proprioceptors are specialized receptors that you'll learn about in the next chapter. And the name of that tract is called the spinocerebellar, but proprioceptors are what we call as always on, meaning that they're constantly sending information to the cerebellum about whether a muscle is contracted or relaxed, about the state of the joint, so that it can make an accurate decision about subconscious muscle movement. Another tract that we're going to talk about later is called the spinothalamic tract. And in this case, we know it's an ascending tract because it begins with spine and ends with thalamus. And it has to do with pain as well. So we'll be talking about that one coming up.